It's a pleasure to be here in this first cycle of conversation with leading Latin American economists, a path out of crisis. And for this first interview, we have the pleasure of having with us Dr. Piero Ghezzi. He's a PhD in economics from Berkeley. He has been professor at Johns Hopkins University and consultant for various international financial organizations. Also, he has a very long and important career in emerging markets, both at Barclays and Deutsche Bank. And he has been also the Ministry of Economy of Peru with Ollanta Humala between 2014 and 2016. And the idea of having Piero here is to talk a bit about Peru, but more importantly, to talk about Latin America in the time of COVID. So without further ado, Piero, I would like to ask you the first question, and it's related to informality. You have been emphasizing for a long time on the need to reduce informality in Peru. So I would like to ask you how relevant have been the very high levels of informality of around 70% of the labor force in Peru in explaining the quite negative outcomes, both in terms of health indicators, the number of deaths per million, and almost the unprecedented contraction of the Peruvian economies in the midst of this pandemic. So, and also this has been in spite of Peru launching one of the largest income support packages as a percentage of GDP in Latin America. So if you can comment on that, we would really like to have your opinion on that.
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation, Lucio. And yes, indeed, Peru has been a little bit puzzled to extend that President Vizcarra decreed a very early and very strict lockdown. But already after 4 or 5 weeks, it became obvious that something wasn't working that well. And obviously exposed has been the result of agglomerations, the result of very, households that are very crowded, and informality. People were able to keep the lockdown for a few weeks, but after a while, right, despite the support package, people had to go out to work. So we really had a very long first wave, right, that basically started from in March and lasted until August. Pretty much there was no, this was a continuation of a very long wave that never stopped until August, where it suddenly stopped. No, it has been coming down significantly in terms of cases, in terms of death. But of course, in the meantime, we had, even using official numbers, the highest death per capita in the world in terms of COVID, and one of the largest contractions in terms of economic activity. I would say that contrary to the general perception, the package hasn't been that large. So I don't think the support policies have been as much as the headline numbers would suggest. So I think if we have to expose, and of course everybody can be, Monday morning quarterback, the problems with the Peruvian response, I think, or the results of COVID, I think I would break it down in two. First, structural reasons related to unemployment, crowded households, etc., and policies, both at the sanitary level, at the fiscal level, at the macro level. In terms of sanitary level, I don't think Peru ever, so we had a very strict lockdown that at the same time induced agglomeration. That was a very clear mistake from the beginning. So because we were so tight, right? People had to live at the same hours, and in mercados, the abastos, right? There were closed spaces that are an excellent opportunity for that virus to propagate. So I think there was a very obvious mistake that Peru made very early on. So tightened so much that left people living at the same time, the same places. And that implied significant agglomerations that we know now are a lot more important than other stuff like cleaning your hands. That was the first thing. So it was a combination of structures and some at the policy level, like errors, I think, at both the sanitary level and the fiscal level. In terms of sanitary level was this, like that, the strict lockdown that induced agglomerations. We never really put together an testing and tracing program. I mean, Peru has been using serological tests all along. We really never developed the capability of molecular tests. So at some point, Peru had incredible number of daily tests, but 95% were serological tests, not molecular tests. So that has been a terrible mistake. And I think at the economic level, probably one of the main problems has not been support the labor market. I think the labor market support has been almost non-existent. There was an initial bonus, an initial subsidy to the payroll, but no more than that. So it's not a terrible, exposed, as I said, we can always explain the bad performance, but I would say there have been a combination of structural reasons, relatively poor policy decisions, particularly on the sanitary health front, and an inability to make correct mistakes. No, because I think we all know that COVID is something that we don't know. We are learning every day. We're still learning, but the ability to learn from what we have seen and make adjustments and corrections has not been particularly present in the government. All that said, the situation is a lot different now than before. You have seen, if you see the active cases and death, I think has been coming down significantly. The hospitals and ICUs are not crowded anymore. So unlike other countries, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, but Peru is right now in the best place it has been since March in terms of the evolution of the pandemic.
Let me stop you there and let me play also devil's advocate, because what you mentioned, particularly in terms of the fiscal response, is that was quite ineffective, and there were also some design problems. But I was wondering, in a country where 70% or more of the population is informal and where many firms are in the informal, how you reach both households and firms. I know that most of the fiscal effort went through some system of guarantees in the formal financial system, but most of the companies in Peru are not formal. So I was wondering, even with the best of intentions, what you would do if you would be in the government, given those restrictions that you have in government, particularly for the fiscal response. And that's a problem that's not unique of Peru. That's something that we have seen in other countries in Latin America, even with lower levels than informality, even in my country, in Argentina. So if you can comment on that, it would be great.
I think that's an excellent question, and there's a clear answer. We can think of Peru as having two financial sectors, right? The banking system, and then all these micro enterprise, finance enterprises, right? The cooperatives, savings and loans cooperatives, etc. Those firms are the ones that normally lend to the informal sector and really weigh down the pyramid, okay? So the problem is that Reactiva Peru, which is the program that you mentioned, the government guarantees program, basically the government guaranteed loans that were that could be repoed at the central bank, right? The central bank issued those soles to the banks. But it was very initially, at least, was very limited, that type of institution that would be able to access to Reactiva Peru. So most of them were the large banks that just don't lend to the MIPES, and certainly don't lend to the informal MIPES. So you had, in the first few months, a channel that basically, in a way, exacerbated inequality, because money went to those firms that actually required less money, and the guys who were more needed didn't have access to Reactiva because the microfinance firms that lend them didn't have access to the window of the central bank of Reactiva Peru. So Peru has a very interesting, because there's no first, there's a development bank, so there's no Banco del Estado or BNDES or whatever. Peru has developed a very sophisticated micro lending, one of the most sophisticated in the world. But the access of those savings and loans cooperatives and finance companies to government guarantees has been very limited. So I think there's one area to improve. A second area is that, of course, these savings and loans cooperatives and all these micro enterprises have been hit because of the pandemic. And what I have been asking since April, actually, is that you have to capitalize them. Because even if you give them money and these firms are concerned about the quality of the credit portfolio, they're not going to lend. And so you need to improve their their ratios and some short-term government capitalization, subordinated bonds or whatever to strengthen their ratios and their balance sheet is necessary for them to lend more. So that has been something that hasn't been done, and they keep asking even now. So at the end of the day, has been the own economy has survived with more informality, with more, right? I mean, and for whatever reason, the own dynamics of the virus, of the pandemic, seem to have work. So there's a reason why, so RT probably is now below 1. I mean, that's the, something has happened, right? I mean, I don't think we got herd immunity in the strict sense of herd immunity, but certainly there's something there where the where cases are coming down and deaths are coming, all the numbers in the pandemic are coming down, and that's
Let me stop you there, and that's, I mean, it's very interesting what you are stressing, because I mean, I was going to ask you why the numbers are improving. I mean, in terms of the number of deaths per million and also the number of cases, and you already have responded that. But I have a question more on the way forward, because I mean, even though the numbers look much better now, when you look at what's going on in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly in Europe, but more recently in the US, the numbers seems to be going up again, and there seems to be also second wave. And you could think that there is something that, you know, some economists like John Cochrane and others have been describing, like, you know, that the virus is becoming endemic. Without the vaccination, what people basically do is they adjust their behavior to the risk of contagion. So they start to wear masks and, you know, engage in social distancing. And then when things seem to be improved, people just relax and they don't engage in this kind of less risky behaviors. And then what happened? Cases go up. So I was going to ask you, the question is Peru now better prepared for a potential second wave? I mean, both on the health camp, both in the health front, but also in the macroeconomic front, particularly on the fiscal front.
I think Peru is better prepared on the health front. Certainly, there has been some increased capabilities in terms of ICUs, in terms of hospital beds, etc. But I actually think that there's something that has happened, which is that the mandatory mask has been very compliant, and social distancing keeps very compliant. I mean, people, I don't leave my house very often, and many people, I mean, if you go in the streets, everybody's using a mask. I mean, there's no informality there. So compliance is 100%, and I have never seen anything compliant 100% in Peru. So it's people are just that we're so scared, and that scariness is not going out easily. So probably what happened is that, of course, the basic reproduction number that are 0 came down, let's say, to 1.3, 1.4, whatever. And then you have, so we had a massive failure. So you probably had 35 of Peruvians having infected. You had like the excess death in Peru is like 90,000. If you use reasonable numbers of fatality rates, you probably may have, you can come up with 50% of population being infected. I think that's an exaggeration, but you could easily have 30%. With the 30% infected people, you already could have the RT, the effective reproduction number, below 1, and that can explain probably the evolution. As you said, that's of course a very fragile equilibrium. It's a precarious equilibrium because it depends on people still changing behavior. But I think it's very different from Europe, very different from the US, where the percentage of people infected is a lot lower because the failure hasn't been that massive, because you really were able in Europe to control the pandemic, right? And the lockdowns worked. The lockdown didn't work in Peru. So you had some sort of, I mean, like a massive infection, and you have seen it region by region. Initially was in the Amazonian regions. You had huge spikes in April and suddenly collapsed in May. And it was not a result of lockdowns or policy. It was a result of a lot of people being infected. Of course, as you have seen the studies, I mean, we don't know how long this immunity lasts. But so Peru is very prepared. I would say that I'm not that pessimistic. I don't think it's so easy to say that we're going to have a second wave. I think we could avoid a second wave at least for a few months. It's not immediate. And I think if it does happen, I think we have more capabilities in the health sector. Now, on the fiscal front, of course, our balance sheet has been, I mean, like we were the jewel, right? I mean, together with Chile, Peru was a star, the macroeconomic star in Latin America. You mentioned, I had, prior to being devoted to productive development policies and productive diversification, was a macrofinance guy in Deutsche Bank and Barclays. And Peru has been the star of the region, together with Chile, with the tightest spreads, the best credit rating. So we got our macro right, and was not enough, right? Clearly was not enough to avoid this very severe contraction. And part of that is because I don't think was particularly well designed. I think it's very easy to expose to say that everything is explained because of informality. I think it's a lot more complex than that. I think you had more degrees of freedom, and we didn't use them all.
Great. But let me take you a bit more forward. And I mean, in a scenario that we might not have a vaccine until, let's say, the end of next year available for all the Latin Americans, and maybe for many of the low, high, middle income countries, maybe in the northern hemisphere that might be available, but most likely that's not going to happen. So, and we're going to see this a scenario where the economy is kind of growing intermittently. I mean, because you have to go back to lockdowns, and maybe more limited way, more limited fashion, regionally, for certain groups of the population. How do you think Peru is going to cope with this scenario, which obviously is not the one that you're going to see a very strong recovery from the global economy, given the continuation of lockdowns?
No, I think we are we were already in a fragile situation prior to COVID, right? A high informality that you suggested, growth rate has been coming down. Let's say the potential growth has been coming down from around 5% a few years before to not higher than 3%. And we had 2% growth prior year. So what the pandemic did is what made obvious exacerbate a problem we had, which is our growth model wasn't working properly. And it was not, we know, of course, it wasn't enough to have a strong macro. So the challenge is huge. We have presidential elections next year. We have, of course, the risk of populism, right, has increased significantly. We have a Congress, right? As you may remember, President Vizcarra closed Congress in September last year. and the new Congress is really extremely populist. So our institutions have been weakened. So it's very easy to be pessimistic about the situation, not just for next year, but in a reasonable horizon. No, I mean, growth perspectives are much weaker than before. Institutions are weak, and our macro is maybe not as strong as it used to be.
Let me take you a bit from the present, if you want, and the immediate future, and maybe talk a bit about more structural issues that are quite close to your heart and also to my heart. And you know that we shared some time talking about that back in Argentina a couple of years ago, or a bit more, which is which is about structural change or the need for diversification in Latin America. You have been a quite strong advocate and also practitioner of policies, active policy for fostering productive diversification and export diversification in your country. I would like to ask you your reflections on the role of these policies in the current situation. Are they still as valid as they were when you were a minister in Peru? They are more needed given the exhaustion of this growth model that you were describing in the case of Peru?
I think they're even more needed. No, the way I see things is that, I mean, like, of course, most Latin American countries have the coexistence of two main sectors, pretty much. An advanced, modern sector, right, integrated into a knowledge economy, right? And a large group of small firms with low productivity, stagnant productivity growth, with very precarious jobs, right? The percentages of each sector vary country by country, right? That size of each bucket. But at the end, we have this dualism, if you wish. And that, of course, is a dystopia. It was not supposed to happen. We were supposed to, even the country have done their deberes, right? Have done things right, like Mexico and Peru in terms of the macro front, should have had the growth of the modern sector that absorb workers from the non-productive sector, agriculture or informal sector, and you had productivity growth and development. That didn't happen, right? And we clearly, in the case of Peru and in the case of Mexico, for example, right, did the right policies in terms of macro. So you could not, of course, we didn't get A+, but certainly we got at least B+ or A- in terms of the macro, right, assignments. So that tells you that there's something that needs to be done to change things. And what you have seen, in my view, is that a collective failure, right? Government has failed, clearly, in the sense of inability to provide public goods and services necessary to reduce this right, dualism. And also, the private sector, the market has failed, right? Because it was supposed to be that you follow these orthodox policies, Washington consensus, you had this growth of the modern sector that absorbed the informal sector. It hasn't happened. So we are in this situation where we need something different. And because everybody fails, doesn't mean that we have to give up. And I would say there are, of course, different alternatives to try. One temptation is almost like going back to the welfare state, right? Trying to give subsidies to everybody, which is in a way what Mexico is doing, right? I mean, like subsidize and give cash transfers directly, but that does not constitute a development model. That's not, right? You are not going to increase productivity in a way to sustain growth over the longer term. So you need to address the underlying constraints to growth and the productivity growth and the welfare, right? Reform and going back to welfare state it's not gonna work. Remember that the neoliberal model is a result of the failure of the previous model, which was more related to the welfare state. So I would say that what we need is, in my view, and it goes probably, I don't even know if we call it anymore just PDPs. It's really a really massive a process of collaboration between the public and the private sector, almost for everything, for providing infrastructure, for providing education, health, and certainly the public goods necessary for a productive diversification. In terms of just productive diversification and productivity, I think our countries have two main challenges. I mean, I call them the macro challenges. One is, how do you sophisticate your economic activities based on what you do well, which is mostly natural resources for most of our countries. How do we use natural resources as a platform, to sophisticate our economic activity? I don't think we can start and say we're going to industrialize. That model may work for Asia, doesn't work for Latin America. We need to use what we have, which is our natural resources, but beware that just if you leave them alone, it's not going to be enough. So that's the reason you probably need productive development policies for this macro challenge. And the other main challenge, which again the size will depend on the country, is what I call the macro challenge of productive inclusion. How do you insert into dynamic value chains a lot of these small firms, So you basically have a lot of these guys who are in the informal economy that are not part of any dynamic value chain. And one of the reasons is not necessarily what my compatriot De Soto says, which is just a lot of tramits and bureaucracy and municipal licenses. It's a lot more than that. They just cannot achieve the quality standards, the environmental standards, the labor standards, the phytosanitary standards, the ethical standards that the formal economy or the global economy demands, So if you are not able to achieve those standards, you cannot sell in the dynamic economy. And so you need to think of policies to achieve what we have talked with Chuck Sable, is a quality hurdle. So there's a big group of firms in an informal economy that are not subsistence, so are beyond subsistence, but have not all the capabilities to be able to sell into dynamic value chains. And it can be in agriculture and in cattle raising, aquaculture, and some manufacturing. And you need to identify what are the problems. In some cases, it's just access to water, access to some basic infrastructure, some technological change, access to finance. You need to see where it is. But I think there is a need to try to work with those small firms and probably in association with a large firm that can help them. Can be suppliers to a large firm to see what can be done. Chile had some success with the suppliers programs and with Corfo, and I think that's a very promising area, and we have seen it in Peru as well very recently, just this year actually, where we are seeing how you can work with some of these firms that actually have many capabilities. So right now they're in the informal sector, but actually have a lot of the capabilities to thrive in the formal sector under the right conditions, But of course, if government doesn't do anything, nothing happens, because to invest in the capabilities to pass the quality hurdle requires investment and resources that they don't have, yes.
No, I wanted to comment on that, where you were describing this type of policies. One thing that Ernesto Steins and other colleagues at ADB, and you and myself, we have been working a lot on these PDPs or whatever you want to call it. But we see that the kind of missing link always in Latin America is in the government or state capabilities, and also related to that, on the stability of these policies. What you see, and I think that happened in Peru, when the Minister of Production or Minister of Industry changes, usually the way the government works in this area also changes, and that kind of jeopardizes these policies, which are by definition long-term policies that entail massive changes in the productive structure. So, I mean, how you can engage and how you can deliver these policies that are so complicated, that needs a coordination across so many areas in the government in a sustainable way with such a weak states in most of the part of the region. Do you think, is it possible to kind of reach some kind of, instead of macro stability, productive stability in terms of productive policies?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think we need to, I would say that the main reason that happens is that people have not become convinced. I would say that in the case of Peru, the establishment really was convinced about the need of macro stability, was not that convinced about the need of these sort of development policies. I would say that state capabilities, of course, I mean, are a binding constraint, but I would say that it's not the most limiting constraint. Because state capabilities are built while doing. So if you start doing stuff, I mean, right now we have a clear example in Peru with the centers for innovation, right? Where they were not doing stuff. Now they are start to become articulators of value chains, right? And in the process, they are doing this stuff. And I would say one of the problems of the class, I mean, the experience in Latin America is that a lot of the coordination problems that you mentioned are at the local level. I mean, a lot of the coordination failures are at the local level. A lot of the cluster policies that have been advocated in Latin America actually work reasonably well when those problems are solved at the local level. But once in a while, quite often I would say, you need to be able to elevate those problems to the national level, right? So there's this complementarity, because if some problems are solved locally, but sometimes I need the decision of government. And I don't know if many governments outside Uruguay probably have really become convinced about the need of this sort of development policies. As you said, I mean, they're like having individual efforts of ministers who've started, but then if the establishment did not buy the idea of the continuity, of course, things stop very quickly. But I would say that I'm more convinced now than before that, the existing model hasn't delivered what we needed. And we need to use this pandemic to realize that we need to start a process of cooperation between the public and the private sector that, as I said, that goes beyond just product development policies, but also in PDPs. We have started to see this recently in Peru, and I hope this lasts, the change in government, but of course it's always a risk. But regardless, what's the alternative? I think we need to think of, if we don't try this, what can we try? We know that just that horizontal policies are not enough. We know that if we do not address the issue of productivity, we are not going to go very far. So what alternative for beyond, you see all these multilateral institutions, right? With all this, you mentioned Ernesto and IDB, but beyond a small group at the IDB. I mean, like all these policy recommendations are strengthen institutions, build human capital, close that infrastructure gap, right? I mean, like the last World Bank report on productivity has a lot of, right, a list of very general recommendations, right, that are not enough. You need to go to the details, right? And it's, of course, intense. So my view is that you have to see how do you leverage the discipline and capabilities of the private sector with the balance sheet, right, and ability to enact laws and norms and regulations from the public sector. That so you need to make it the least, right, dependent on just huge government capabilities, right? And that's part of the. So finance has to be clearly a very important part of the solution, but very, right, smart finance. But so how do you, and I strongly believe that you need to strengthen not only the cooperation between public sector and private sector, but also within the private sector, between like big firms and small suppliers. And that allows the discipline. When you have just small firms with government, you run the risk of doing policies that don't have demand, right? There's no market demand. So you, right, there's a lot of creativity and you create some products, but now nobody wants to buy them. When you have the smaller tractora, right, the tractor in a value chain, the tractor already knows the client, knows the customer, and knows what it right, the requirements that need to get from the suppliers. So you need to focus on those value chains. I am increasingly convinced, and that happens a lot at the territorial level.
Just a final question, and you were basically commenting that populism is also knocking the door in Peru and also maybe in the neighboring Chile. And I mean, I wanted to ask you about the region is kind of entering a kind of dangerous waters, you know, because I mean, even in the best scenario, the region is going to have the government quite, you know, sustainably damage balance sheets in the government, but also firms, high levels of debt. Most likely, in terms of growth, GDP growth potential is going to be diminished, and maybe the region is going to come back to the level that was in terms of production, maybe back in 3-4 years' time. So how do you see that? I mean, because I mean, even the countries that have been successful on the macroeconomic front and have created these independent institutions, the central bank, and also fiscal laws, etc., we see that they are also struggling with this problem in Latin America of, you know, a mismatch between massive demands that are increasing with the level of income per capita, at the same time, ever and ever diminishing capability from the government to provide the goods and services the population is demanding. So if you can comment on that, what's your view on what's going on, even if Latin America gets out of this terrible pandemic?
Yeah, I think we probably will get out one way or another out of this pandemic, but clearly what you comment is a very significant, more than a risk, right? I mean, we already had the plebiscite in Chile during the weekend. I think for Peru, the writing is on the wall. I think we are going to write the request for changing the constitution from Fujimori looks so similar to changing the constitution from Pinochet that that is appealing. I don't think it's going to solve much because the problems in Peru have little to do with the constitution and a lot more to do with our collective inability, as I say, to provide the public goods and services needed for the population. So yes, the risks are very large because the type of policies that I am convinced, and when we have seen it at the macro level, they can work very well, require time, patience, and to have people convinced, and that's not very prevalent in Latin America. So I would say outside Uruguay, because I think Uruguay is the country that has, but by far has the largest probability of becoming developed in Latin America. Outside Uruguay, the rest of the region runs the risk of falling into this trap of populist policies, weaker institutions, weaker macro, and inability to growth, and inability to provide public services. So yes, I mean, like it can be a terrible decade. I mean, even worse than the previous one. For some countries that, as you said, like clearly Peru and Chile, were up until now, right, macro stars, right, at different development stages, but both countries, right, doing the right stuff in theory, but clearly with clear weaknesses. I do not know if the reaction to the neoliberal model is going to be the right reaction, which is right, this cooperation of the public and the private sector, or is going to be more of a Mexican type subsidies and right, and that I don't think is going to take us too far away. We need a development model, and there is a development model that could work based on our strengths. I don't know if we're going to have the political and the collective will to follow it. So the risks are there, and yeah, I mean, it's very easy to be pessimistic. With this pessimist note.
With the pessimist note, we finalize the interview, and thank you, Piero. It has been really a pleasure talking to you, going from macro to micro, from the present to the immediate future, but also the long-term challenges and also opportunities that the region has. Because, I mean, just to finalize in a kind of positive and optimistic note, you basically said we are in a region which is rich in natural resources, which has shown a massive success in the last 28 years in terms of achieving macro stability in many countries in the region. And we have an opportunity, even though there are the risks around there, for sure there is an opportunity for escaping from the trap.
Exactly. And there's a path of those of us who believe in these sort of policies, right? Exactly. Of public-private cooperation. We need to, I mean, we can't give up. We need to continue, right? Finding ways of working them within the political constraints. Okay.
Excellent.